This is the new McLaren Artura. It sits above the GT and below the 720S in the McLaren range, costing £185,500. And although at first glance it has a very familiar look, it really is new. No more of that V8, instead a plug-in hybrid powertrain with a new V6 and an electric motor. That means outputs of 671 brake horsepower and 531 pounds-foot of torque. This can drive around on battery power only for nearly 20 miles and up to 80 miles an hour. 0 to 62 miles an hour, 3 seconds dead. 0 to 124 miles an hour, 8.3 seconds, and it will do 205 miles an hour flat out. But you'd expect all that. It's a supercar. They're all plenty quick enough. What you're thinking is, well, it's hybrid, so it's going to be heavy. But no, they've saved weight all over the car, starting with the new carbon fibre monocoque, which is built up in their new factory in Sheffield. Yes, it weighs 82 kilos, which is 6 kilos more than the one you'd have found on the 570S, but that includes the section for the batteries. And like for like, it's lighter as well as stronger because now it includes the B-pillars and various fixings for hinges on the doors and pickup points elsewhere. 6 kilos have been saved in the doors themselves, 8 kilos have been saved with the seats. The engine, 50 kilos lighter, that new V6. The wiring loom itself, it's a new Ethernet wiring loom which requires less wiring and is 10% lighter. The end result is the fact that although the whole hybrid architecture adds 140 kilos, 88 kilos of that being in the batteries, which is situated low down just behind the seats underneath the fuel tank. This car weighs just 46 kilos more than a 570S. A din weight of 1498 kilos, a dry weight of 1395 kilos. For some perspective, the din weight of a basic 992 Carrera is 1505 kilos. Pretty impressive, I think you'll agree. One of the other ways this has saved weight is by keeping it rear-wheel drive, no power to the front wheels like in the Honda NSX or Ferrari's SF90. Now I want to talk about that V6 engine, but before we leave the front of the car, I think it's worth taking a moment for the overall design because yes, it's more of an evolution than a revolution, but there are all sorts of details in it. It's all at once cleaner because you've got things like, if you just have a look here, this here now, there's no brake here, so you get this amazing sort of stretched, taut look across the top of the car with these buttresses which actually feed air in at the bottom of them. And then you've got details that aren't quite as clean. So you've got these vents here which actually alleviate the pressure from in the arches but also then feed the air down the side of the car. The lights, well, we've got the recognisable socket headlights now, so which we first saw on the 720S, but you've also got the shape there with a graphic, I suppose, which is so well known from McLaren's. Moving back round to the front, you've got a sensor down the front now for adaptive cruise control, and we've also got the sensor in the windscreen you can see up there which recognises the signs, and also we've got automatic high beam for the first time. Little things that haven't been available on McLaren's before, perhaps not sort of, they're not groundbreaking as such, but things that should make this car easier to live with as well as being fast. One thing, single wiper, and no nozzles either. I love single wipers. There's just something very motorsport about them, isn't there? The colour? Flux green, which brings us on really to that powertrain. The Artura uses an axial flux motor, which is small enough to be located within the gearbox's bell housing. It weighs just 15.4 kilos, which is less than half that of the 38 kilo radial flux e-motor in the McLaren P1. And in fact, the only other supercar application of an axial flux motor that we've seen so far is in the back of Ferrari's SF90. It can put out 94 brake horsepower and 166 pounds-foot of torque, although that maximum power is transient, dropping to 49 brake horsepower after 15 seconds of full throttle. Should be enough. The new M630 engine is a 120-degree all-aluminium V6, with the ball-bearing turbo sitting in the V, a dry sump and electric wastegates. It will rev to 8,500 RPM, puts out 577 brake horsepower and 431 pounds-foot of torque. It's called a hot V for a reason, and you can see the powertrain chimney that will vent hot air up through the rear deck. The new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission is 40mm shorter than the old 7-speed, and there is no reverse gear as the e-motor simply rotates in the opposite direction. For this reason, the battery is never allowed to fully discharge. As well as being charged via the combustion engine while driving, the 7.4 kWh battery can be charged to 80% in 2.5 hours via a standard EVSE cable. Under WLTP testing, it should achieve over 50 mpg and emit 129 grams per kilometre of CO2. Of course, that fuel economy does rather depend on what mode you're in. Pure EV mode I've already mentioned. Comfort mode still shuts off the combustion engine at small throttle openings and below 25 miles an hour. Sport and track then deploy the e-motor increasingly aggressively, with pure performance in mind, boosting low-end response and acceleration with torque infill. In fact, the Artura's throttle response is said to be twice that of McLaren's non-hybrid cars. So there we are, that's a few more details about the powertrain in this car. One of the big unknowns obviously is how that V6 will sound through these exhausts. Now, high level up here to clear the diffuser down there. I love around the back of here, just this super clean rear deck of the car, all of which actually, so this car has got 50 kilos of downforce overall compared to a previous sports series, the 570S, which was sort of downforce neutral. Which brings me on to the handling, because how is all that power and torque going to be translated onto the road? What's it going to feel like to drive on road or track? Well, one of the big things that they're talking about is down here, it's the rear suspension. So they've gone to a multi-link setup, so you've still got the fixed rear wishbone at the top, but you've got a multi-link setup down at the bottom, and you've got a particularly aggressive toe link on this. The reason for this is basically to increase camber stiffness and particularly toe stiffness. The reason for that, well, how I had it described to me is on the road, if you are going down, say, those sort of width restricted lanes on the motorway or autobahn or auto route, and you know when you sit in those for ages and it's just, particularly in a wide car where you're sitting there and it's a bit nervous and you're sort of thinking, oh, I just want to, it feels like it's wandering around a bit and you're constantly having to work at the steering just to keep it within that lane. That's generally because you haven't got enough toe stiffness in the rear. Now, on a track, how it manifests itself, well, that I know well, because in a 570S, if you were going around a track, I remember particularly at Goodwood, quickly fast track, and you coming off throttle as you turn in, or if you brake to turn in, then you had a really loose feeling rear end, which I happen to really, really like, but I completely understand that not everybody did. So what they've done is basically tried to make the rear end of this car much more stable than it was in the previous Sport Series. Now you might think, well, that sounds a bit dull, but what it's also been able to enable them to do is add grip in other areas. So we have a shorter wheelbase, obviously giving greater agility, so it's 30mm shorter than a 720S or the previous Sport Series. We've also got wider tyres, so we've got a wider tyre at the front, it's gone up from 225 to 235, and then at the rear we've now got a 295 as opposed to 285. Steering also, that's slightly sort of, they've gone stiffer, more aggressive, more like 600 LT before, which you wouldn't have wanted to do obviously with the old 570S or Sports Series, because if you add in the agility at the front and then you've got the loose rear, well, it's just a recipe for, well, perhaps not disaster, but an awful lot of fairly overactive oversteer. The other big thing around the back of the car, which they're trumpeting in terms of handling, is the e-diff. Now, you might remember that McLaren up to now, famously really, mostly because of, I think, Chris Goodwin, who was against having a limb slip diff in the cars, they haven't had a limb slip diff. Now they have this e-diff. And what that's given them is, well, more options really. Again, it helps give you stability in the car, but it should also help you in drift. So they're saying this is more driftable, sort of not just on the way out of the corners, but on the way in as well. So if you think of the e-diff gives you all sorts of options in terms of being able to open it and close it at various points in the corner. So if you're going into the corner, you'd have it closed, so you give yourself more stability under braking. Then as you get to the apex, you want to open it right out, so you get that sort of ability to just rotate the car at the apex of the corner. And then of course you want it locking up as you sort of pile on the power and drive out of the corner. Also, when you're sliding the car, the diff, if you've got it sort of working really well, obviously, then it should just give you a bit more progression, because sometimes McLaren's, it worked really well before. I'm not going to say that sort of suddenly not having a diff didn't work, because it did. It worked really well with their use of sort of brake management, but it should just mean that particularly I think those smaller angles of drift and where it starts, that's where you should notice the difference in this. So there we are, that's a bit on the ride and handling. Oh, I suppose dampers, I should really mention those. This has got the proactive damper control, so that we saw first on the McLaren GT. So that sort of, it doesn't exactly read the road like a camera, but it does react to whatever is underneath it via all the various sensors over the car. Anyway, I think it's time we went and had a look inside. While I'm ensconcing myself in the cockpit, I should just mention the brakes, which are carbon ceramic discs measuring 390mm at the front and 380mm at the rear. They're clamped by aluminium calipers from the same family as the system used on the 600LT and 720S. A bespoke brake booster and electrically driven vacuum pump ensure pedal pressures remain consistent whether the car is running on its internal combustion engine or electric power alone. The fact there is no regen through the brakes should also aid pedal feel. Anyway, looks like I'm sitting comfortably now. One thing I probably should have mentioned with regards to the handling is really to do with the steering, because it's still hydraulically power assisted steering, so I'm so glad they have kept that. It's always been one of the highlights of McLaren's. And the other thing they haven't changed really is the steering wheel. Still no buttons on the steering wheel, still very focused, still a really nice shape and great to hold. What they have changed in here is, well, pretty much everything, to be honest, in here has changed. But let's start with what I can see in front of me. So now if you move this, the binnacle is attached to the steering column, so it moves with the steering wheel, so it should always be absolutely perfect in terms of your sight of the screen in front of you. In fact, one of the sort of side points of that is they've obviously had to strengthen the steering column to take the extra weight of the binnacle, which then has knock-on effects for well, the steering in general, because it's a stiffer steering column, so you get better feedback through it. It's just nice little details like that. As you can see, we don't have the active panel down here. We've now got these little rockers up here, so we've still got powertrain and handling, so you can still split out those two. If you start the car up, it starts up in EV mode, which is for sort of emissions regs, until you put the powertrain from EV to comfort or sport or track, and then on this side for the handling, which really only just changes the damper stiffness from comfort to sport to track. So you can then should be able to pretty much reach those fairly easily, certainly without having to reach all the way down there and look at them, which is nice. I should say this car is, so you have pure at the bottom in terms of trim levels, and then you've got sort of three above them. One is Tech Looks, I can't remember what the other one is. This is Vision, so you've got all the sort of, well, yes, green piping on here and grey and contrasting stitching, and also these rather nice metal paddles on the back there. Other things to mention here, the visibility has always been another key McLaren component, and that certainly seems to be retained in here. They've been talking about the sort of over-the-shoulder visibility out of here, and it does seem pretty good. It's not perhaps quite as good as 720S, but it is nonetheless, for a supercar, very good. Back here as well, a bit more storage behind there. Worth mentioning that in the front, the frunk, as it were, is the same size as before. It's essentially a slightly better shape, they're saying, than it was in 570S, despite the extra gubbins for the HVAC system, which they say they've basically over-spec'd massively. So it can run obviously with the engine off, because you want to be able to have it running whilst you're in EV mode. We've got vents along here, so the sort of diffuse vents, you don't have to have all the air coming out of here. The screens, obviously the one up here which goes through various different modes depending on which powertrain mode you are in. You can also have a reduced or stealth mode in this, which just takes away all the clutter, as it were, from the screen, so you can really focus when you're driving, particularly on track or perhaps at night as well. Screen down here, most important thing really is that you can now get Apple CarPlay or Android Auto on it, so that should answer a lot of the usability criticisms that have been there in the past. Other little things as well. Now the nose lift is just a button down there. It was previously on a stalk down here, which is always, I'm sure if you're an owner, probably it was easy enough to find or you got used to it, but I always find jumping in and out of the car, it's always a bit of a faff. It didn't seem very intuitive. So things like that, they've just tried to clean up. Something else to mention, these seats are a big part of the interior. So it's standard, you get these sort of sports seats, I suppose, that you can spec comfort seats, but they reckon these are now comfortable enough to spec as standard. So they give you the comfort and adjustment of the non-fixed back bucket seat, but also the support and the lightweight properties of a full bucket. So the way it adjusts is just by a button down here again that's been designed to be slightly easier, and it sort of moves up like that, which is quite fun. It sort of makes sense. I can see how that does work in the sort of the arc that it works in. There's also more room in here than there was in 570S as well, just subtly a bit more elbow room, a bit more headroom. It's more spacious for somebody that's as tall as me, sort of nearly 6'5". Other little geeky facts, well, we've got the light motif that goes around here, that when you open the doors up you can see speakers. We've got a Bowers and Wilkins system in here. Usually in a supercar you'd have the bass speaker in the door, which is not great in terms of stiffness of mounting. So in this they put them down in the footwell, and actually it's partially attached to the carbon tub, which is great for the sound that it can then produce through that. What else to mention? Warranties, I suppose, because McLaren is keen to sort of dispel any thoughts of unreliability, so it's been actually trumpeting the warranties for this car. So you've got a 6-year warranty on the battery, 5-year overall car warranty, and 10-year corrosion warranty on this. Other than that, there's just a lot to take in. It really is a new McLaren, a very new McLaren. Not perhaps a new beginning, because I think it feels like it's building on everything that they've done for the last 10 years or so. And that's the nice thing. I think that's what I've taken away from this car. If you look at it, then the looks, perhaps no, they're not as totally sort of new and fresh as you might have expected, but you can tell that they've listened. They've kept the things that people like the hydraulic power assisted steering. No need to change that at all. It has always been absolutely fabulous. But they have done all sorts of things where perhaps people have been critical in the past and taken this opportunity to move their cars on. And from what I gather as well, they've taken that opportunity in the manufacturing as well. So the things that they haven't been able to do because they've essentially been using the same architecture and the same engine, they've been able to change things in terms of the manufacturing process, which are things that you and I will never see or really know about, but should make a better car overall. So there we are, a new McLaren Artura. All that remains really is to see how it drives and hear how that V6 sounds. Let me know what you think about this. Are you excited about it? Does it go far enough? Does it answer criticisms you might have had about McLarens in the past? Are you excited to see what it does on a track? Let us know in the comments below. But for now, thank you very much for watching.